Hey, everybody, welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast. This is Ryan Jordan, and today's episode is a skills short about living in your tent in inclement weather. Now, I know nobody likes to be storm bound when it's raining hard outside, but sometimes we have to be for either safety reasons or we just don't want to deal with the inconvenience of living outdoors when it's pouring down rain. And so we might hole up in our tent for anywhere from an hour to several hours to, in some cases, depending on where you are, even a couple of days to wait out a storm because it's too risky to move. So today's episode is really about giving you some tips and tricks for living in a tent in inclement weather and managing the inevitable condensation that will come when you are spending long periods of time inside an enclosed space during cold and wet conditions. First, let's talk about what happens when there's a human body inside a tent and it's respiring moisture and you have wet gear in there and maybe you're cooking in the vestibule. In general, you're spewing all sorts of moisture into this tiny enclosed environment. And that means you're going to have to deal with condensation. Now, condensation forms in one of two ways. The first way is when the air inside the tent becomes what we call oversaturated or supersaturated. So that means the carrying capacity of the air for water vapor molecules becomes 100%. This is a relative humidity of 100%. Now, beyond that, if you're putting more moisture into the air, that moisture has to go somewhere because the air can no longer hold it. And the obvious place where that moisture is going to go is on any exposed surface inside the tent. So that could be your gear, it could be the inside of the tent walls, and in very humid environments, it could even be your clothing and skin. You'll feel that humid, cold air inside the tent. Now, the best way to manage condensation like this is by getting airflow through the tent. So some tents have vents and doors that you can open to promote airflow through the tent, and that allows cold, dry air to come inside the tent and replace the warm, moist air. So that warm, moist air can then exit the tent, and that will ultimately help keep your tent drier by using these vents and doors and things like that. Now, if there's wind blowing, that's a bonus. That's a good thing when it comes to managing condensation because that wind can do a couple of things. First, it can promote the exchange of dry air with moist air inside the tent. And second, as it blows across the outside of a tent fabric, especially if the tent fabric is breathable, then what you get is an effect by which breathability is enhanced because you're constantly sweeping away that moist air that is escaping through the breathable fabric of the tent. Now, the second way that condensation can form is strictly a result of temperature. So let's say you have the air inside a tent that is 45 degrees, and maybe the relative humidity inside your tent's only 80%. Now, if it gets too cold, in other words, if it gets below the dew point of that air, so maybe that dew point is somewhere in the low 30s, let's say the outside temperature gets to be that low, then the air that comes in contact with surfaces that are that cold becomes supersaturated, and that moisture has to go somewhere, and that means it's going to exit the air and condense onto that cold surface. Okay, so there are the two ways condensation can form. One way we manage it, as I already mentioned, is by promoting airflow through the tent. The other way is to minimize the introduction of wet, moist air into the tent in the first place. Now, I'm not advocating that you stop breathing or stop perspiring or things like that, but I am advocating that you pay attention to the moisture you're putting into the tent, and that starts with your gear. So let's say you're setting up your tent in a storm, you get inside, you have your rain gear on, it's soaking wet, maybe some of your clothing is damp, you have damp shoes and all this kind of stuff. And all that stuff is a source of moisture inside your tent, and you've got to deal with it somehow. So part of my routine, whenever I get inside a tent and I have wet clothes and gear to deal with, is my sleeping bag stuff sack, which I've been using lately the past year or so, an Osprey straitjacket compression sack. Typically for 3-season use, I use the 20-liter model, and inside my pack that stores my sleeping bag, my sleeping pad, my pillow, extra socks, and probably my base layer bottoms, my long underwear. So when I remove that stuff inside the tent, I immediately turn that compression sack inside out. And then I put the wet gear in there. So my wet shoes are going in there, my wet socks, my gaiters, my wet rain jacket and rain pants. And then I zip it up from the outside. And what I'm basically doing is enclosing all my wet gear in a non-breathable container so that the moisture from that wet gear can no longer be a source of moisture inside the tent. Now, if you have a tent with a vestibule, maybe you'll store your wet gear in that vestibule. So one of the tents I've been using and testing lately is the Locust Gear Jedi, which does not have a vestibule. So as I've encountered really wet conditions this spring and early summer, this has kind of been my mode of operation. So I like to keep all my gear inside my tent, and this is how I manage wet gear without allowing that wet gear to be a source of moisture inside the tent, which can increase condensation dramatically. Okay, let's talk a little bit about setting up and taking down a shelter in inclement weather. Now, the Locust Gear Jedi that I've been using is an interesting tent because you can actually stake it out, crawl inside the tent, and erect the tent by assembling the poles while inside the tent. And the tent can then stay mostly dry during wet conditions. And you can reverse this process and take it down, pack up all your gear inside the tent, and then collapse the poles, pack those away. And all you have left is to throw your pack outside, exit the tent, zip the tent up, and then you can roll up the wet tent, and nothing inside the tent will ever get wet. Not all tents allow you to do this. And so there's this model of a tent that's commonly referred to as a European style tent. And it's where the inner tent can pitch independently and more specifically after the outer fly is pitched. That way you can pitch the outer fly, get inside, get out of the weather, and you don't have to deal with getting the inner tent out pitched and getting that part of the tent wet. And then when you're ready, you can pitch the inner tent completely separately and it stays totally dry. Likewise, when you are packing up your shelter, you can reverse this process and pack up the inner tent, safely stow it away so it's nice and dry, and then pack up the outer fly when everything else is packed up. Now, American tents did not always follow this model, and so invariably the process for pitching an American style tent was to pitch the inner tent first, because usually that part of the tent was integrated with the pole set. And of course, a lot of these inner tents are made of mesh or non-waterproof fabrics. And so if you're doing this in inclement weather, you get rain getting the inner tent very wet before you have a chance to throw the fly on and pitch it properly. And the whole thing creates this mess of moisture. Now remember, because the inner tent is wet, it now becomes a source of moisture that can promote condensation in your shelter. Now, some manufacturers have started to think this through on the American side of the pond and are creating designs where the fly can be pitched separately from the inner. This usually requires some kind of inner tent clip system. And one of the examples I'll talk about here is the REI Quarter Dome SL1. I will put a link in the show notes to my video review on YouTube of that tent, and I show very specifically how to deal with this type of shelter in inclement weather so that you can pitch the fly first, follow up with the inner tent, and manage condensation in a much better way than if you were to pitch the inner tent first. Now, when it comes time to go to bed, and you're dealing with inclement weather, consider your typical routines before you go to sleep. You need to cook your dinner. You need to maybe go for one last pee break outside. and then organize and set up your gear appropriately. So let's talk about cooking in a tent. I want to make it very clear that you should not cook in a tent. Now, that being said, I know that it happens sometimes, and we need to acknowledge that, and we need to teach people how to do it safely. I'm in the process of creating a very detailed and comprehensive video that shows you specifically how to cook inside a fully enclosed tent without dying. This is really risky, and if you don't understand the risks involved with cooking in the tent, not only from the standpoint of carbon monoxide poisoning, which can kill you, but also from the standpoint of lighting your tent on fire because your stove flame is coming into contact with the tent fabric. So I'm going to save this part of the discussion for the video review because it's not an ideal discussion to have in a podcast only format. You've got to see exactly what's going on when I cook inside a tent, and you need the visuals for that. So all I'm going to say about cooking in a tent is not that you need to minimize the risk, which of course you do, but you need to accept the potential consequence that you could burn your tent down or create an environment where carbon monoxide builds up inside your tent and causes you to go unconscious and to possibly die. It's a very serious issue. Like I said, let's save this one for the video that will come out a bit later. Now, in terms of getting up in the middle of the night to go pee, if you know you're going to be in inclement weather, I strongly suggest taking a wide mouth 16-ounce Nalgene canteen. That's my choice for an in-tent pee bottle. And that's a really nice thing to have, especially as the temperatures get very cold or you're dealing with all night downpours. It's just so nice to be able to kneel in your tent and go to the bathroom inside the tent without having to don your rain gear and go out in the wet rain and get soaking wet and cold and then having to bring all that moisture back inside your tent for the rest of the night. So a pee bottle for me is a key piece of equipment for camping in very wet environments. Now, remember when I was talking about storing wet gear, I stored my wet shoes in my inside out sleeping bag sack. Now, what if I do need to go outside and maybe the weather is breaking and I don't want to put on my wet shoes and socks and deal with all that, but maybe I just want to go outside to take a picture, or I want to go outside to go to the bathroom. Maybe the storm has broken a little bit and during that break in the storm, I want to go make some coffee. Now, I'm not a huge fan of walking around camp barefoot. I think it's risky. I've had little cuts on my feet before, and there's always that risk of getting those cuts infected, especially with staph bacteria that can cause trip-ending infections and become very serious very rapidly. So I strongly recommend you never walk around barefoot in camp. So what I like to do is put on a nice, thick, warm pair of socks, and then I'll take 2 extra stuff sacks that had been storing gear inside my pack, and I'll slide those on over my feet. And then I can walk around outside on damp ground, even on snow, and that moisture is not going to come through my feet, and I can go out for an incidental errand outside my tent without getting my feet soaking wet, and they still stay protected from cuts and abrasion. Finally, let's talk about packing up wet gear and especially a wet tent. So if you're careful about packing up your camp, you might be able to keep most, if not every piece of gear you have dry except that outer tent fly that has been subjected to the storm, right? So what I like to do is store that outer fly outside my pack so that I'm not introducing moisture to other gear that's inside my pack. And one of the places I like to store it is inside a mesh pocket that is affixed to the outside of the pack. A great pack that has this style of pocket is the new Hyperlight Mountain Gear Junction. I will link to my review of that pack in the show notes. And when I'm taking a pack like this, I take advantage of that outer mesh pocket to store wet gear. And then when the sun comes out during my hike throughout the day, I can remove that wet shelter from the mesh pocket, lay it out to dry. And really this process only takes 10 minutes to 30 minutes, depending on how intense the sun and what the temperature is and things like that. But it's a really good investment of time. So you're not carrying that moisture with you for the rest of the day, which, makes for a lighter pack. Some of these tent flies can absorb up to 50% of their weight in water and more if it's something like sil nylon or a heavy nylon. They can absorb 2 times or more their weight in water. And then the second benefit of that is that you have a dry canopy when it comes time to set up your shelter in camp that night. Okay, so that's our skills short for the day, camping in inclement, wet weather. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it provided some valuable tips and tricks for you. And be sure to check out the show notes. We'll link to some other articles that have some insight into hiking and camping in wet weather. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'm Ryan Jordan with Backpacking Light. Happy trails.